The year was 1920, and the world was still reeling from the devastation of the Great War. While the guns had fallen silent in Europe, new conflicts were igniting elsewhere. In Russia, a brutal civil war raged between the Red Bolsheviks and the White counter-revolutionaries. And in the midst of this chaos, a small detachment of American soldiers, remnants of the Polar Bear expedition, found themselves stranded deep in enemy territory. Lieutenant James Harlow pulled his tattered coat tighter around his frame as the bitter Russian wind howled through the skeletal remains of the village they had once called their outpost. His men, no more than 30 now, huddled together for warmth in the ruins of a burned-down farmhouse, their faces hollow from hunger and exhaustion. Sergeant Patrick O'Connor, a grizzled veteran of the trenches, crouched beside him, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Reinforcements ain't coming, are they, sir?" Harlow shook his head.
"No, Pat.
"We're on our own." The realization settled over them like the falling snow. The White Army they had been aiding was in full retreat, their officers abandoning the fight one by one. The Bolsheviks, relentless and unforgiving, were closing in. A fading hope. Movement, came a hushed cry from Private Thomas Wilkes, his frostbitten fingers gripping his rifle. Harlow raised his binoculars. A column of red soldiers was approaching from the valley below.
Hundreds of them.
They marched in tight formations, their banners rippling in the wind, their bayonets glinting in the pale winter light. O'Connor cursed under his breath. "That's a damn army." Harlow turned to his men. "We hold this position. We fight until the last bullet, the last breath." No one argued. They all knew what surrender meant. They had seen what happened to White Army prisoners, executed without mercy. For them, there was no retreat, only survival. As the Reds drew closer, Harlow's mind raced. The village provided some cover, but they had limited ammunition, and food had run out days ago. If they were to stand a chance, they needed a plan. The first attack. The Bolsheviks came at dawn, their battle cries echoing through the valley as they charged up the slopes. The Americans and their remaining white allies opened fire, the staccato bursts of gunfire breaking the morning silence. Harlow's rifle kicked against his shoulder as he took down a red soldier mid-charge. O'Connor manned the only working machine gun, mowing down waves of attackers as they tried to breach the defenses. The first wave fell, their bodies littering the frozen ground, but more came. A grenade exploded near Wilkes, sending him sprawling. Harlow rushed to him, dragging the wounded soldier to cover. "Stay with me, Tom." Wilkes gritted his teeth against the pain. "They just keep coming, sir." Harlow knew he was right. The enemy had numbers, they did not. This wasn't a battle they could win, only one they could delay. A betrayal in the ranks. That night, as they licked their wounds, a shadow moved in the dark. Corporal Elias Monroe, a former mercenary, had vanished from his post. When O'Connor found his tracks leading down the valley, they knew. "He's selling us out." O'Connor spat. Harlow's stomach turned. Monroe knew their positions, their numbers. If he reached the enemy, they were done. Without hesitation, Harlow and 2 men gave chase. The snow crunched under their boots as they followed the traitor's trail. When they found him, Monroe was already speaking to a Bolshevik officer near a cluster of trees. Harlow didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired. Monroe crumpled, his betrayal cut short. The Bolsheviks returned fire, and Harlow's team barely made it back to the village. The Reds would come in full force now. There was no doubt. The last stand. Morning arrived with a blood-red sky. The final assault was upon them. The Bolsheviks attacked with everything they had: artillery, mortars, endless waves of infantry. Harlow fought like a man possessed, his rifle an extension of himself. O'Connor was everywhere at once, dragging wounded men to cover, firing until his weapon overheated. Wilkes, despite his injury, kept shooting, his face set in grim determination. One by one the defenders fell. The enemy was too many. A bullet slammed into Harlow's shoulder, knocking him back. He gasped, his vision swimming. The world spun, the screams of his men blending into a cacophony of chaos. Through the haze, he saw O'Connor go down, a bayonet piercing his chest. Wilkes, bleeding and barely able to stand, fired until he had nothing left. As the enemy swarmed over them, Harlow felt the cold embrace of the snow. His hand tightened around his rifle. This was it. The end. But they had fought. They had made their stand. And they would be remembered.
Epilogue.
Days later, when White Army scouts returned, they found the village silent, its defenders lying where they had fallen. But the bodies of the Red soldiers far outnumbered the dead Americans. News of their stand spread, inspiring those still fighting the Bolsheviks. Though their deaths did not change the course of the war, their courage became legend. Lieutenant James Harlow and his men had made their mark on history, not through victory, but through valor. The frozen valley, once nameless, would forever be remembered as Red Valley, where a handful of Americans stood against an army and fought to the last.